Welcome to The Explainer. So today, we're diving into a really provocative idea from TULWA philosophy, one that challenges a spiritual goal that a lot of people aim for, the higher self. But is it really the path to enlightenment, or could it actually be a trap? Let's get into it. Right off the bat, the article we're looking at makes this incredibly bold claim. It's not holding anything back. It basically says that this thing so many of us are chasing, this so-called higher self, might be the very thing that's blinding us to the messy, gritty, real work of transformation. Okay, so before we unpack that pretty heavy critique, we gotta make sure we're all on the same page. What is this higher self anyway? Let's take a look at the promise. The one that's made this whole concept so popular. So the higher self is usually pitched as this perfect, ultimate version of you. An all-knowing guide, completely free from all the messiness and struggle of being human, and it's just hanging out in some higher dimension, waiting for you to dial in and connect. And you can see why this is so appealing, right? I mean, who wouldn't want absolute clarity and a total end to suffering? The promise is basically a kind of spiritual shortcut, a way to get this life of purpose and peace without having to do all the messy, difficult, human work. But this is where the TULWA perspective hits the brakes, and hard. The author asks us to really consider if this comforting promise is actually more of a trap than a tool. And that really gets us to the heart of the argument. Is this promise of an easy path actually a dangerous detour? The source material argues that, this exact story we tell ourselves can actively prevent real, genuine, lasting personal growth. The TULWA critique really boils down to these three core problems. It argues that the higher self concept, first, helps us avoid our own issues. Second, it turns spirituality into something you can buy. And third, it distracts us from the real internal work we actually need to do. All right, so problem number one is something called spiritual bypassing. This is when we use spiritual ideas to dodge uncomfortable emotions or our own personal baggage. Basically, instead of actually facing your own shadows, you just try to vibrate higher and kind of float above the real problem. The second big problem, spirituality gets turned into a product. The article points to the absolute explosion of courses and gurus out there promising to sell you a connection to your higher self. The author even recalls meeting people who claimed they'd eliminated their ego after just a single weekend workshop, which just shows how easily enlightenment can get commodified. And finally, it's a huge distraction. I mean, think about it. If you're chasing this idealized external version of yourself, you're being encouraged to reject all the parts of you that are flawed or messy or in pain. But true transformation comes from integrating all parts of yourself, the light and the dark, not from trying to chop off the bits you don't like. So you might be wondering, where does such a strong take even come from? Well, this isn't just some abstract philosophy. It's actually rooted in the author's own very personal and very painful experience. It's what led to the creation of the TULWA philosophy itself. The author tells this story of trusting what he thought was a benevolent spiritual guide, an entity that he actually let into his life. But this guide turned out to be a deception, a complete manipulation. The discovery just shattered his entire spiritual framework and sent him into a profound existential crisis. Being reduced to what he calls just 2 or 3 threads of understanding forced a really painful but crucial realization. Real spiritual strength isn't something you outsource to a guide or a concept. It has to be built from your own inner core, piece by painful piece. To challenge that common idea that some higher power would inflict pain on us to force our growth, the author uses this really stark analogy from the anti-war movement. The point is that the logic is just fundamentally flawed. Adding more pain to someone's life to teach them a lesson is a contradiction in terms. It doesn't lead to harmony. So if the higher self is a detour, what's the alternative? Well, TULWA philosophy proposes a totally different path, one it calls grounded liberation. And the contrast between these two paths it's just night and day. The higher self approach is all about escape, connecting to something external, treating the ego like an enemy to be destroyed, and bypassing suffering. Grounded liberation is the exact opposite. It's about engagement. integrating your whole self, learning to use the ego as a tool, and confronting suffering head-on in order to transform it. This path of grounded liberation unfolds in 3 steps. It's not about seeking something out there, but about doing the hard work in here. First, you turn inward and confront the shadows, all the stuff you'd rather avoid. Then, you start to dismantle the comforting illusions that are actually keeping you stuck. And finally, you reclaim your own power, building resilience from your own inner core. Now, the article is really careful to point out that it isn't presenting this as the one and only absolute truth. It's a perspective, one that was forged through decades of experience. The ultimate goal here is about empowering you. And this all leads to the biggest takeaway from the TULWA perspective. Stop seeking. Stop looking for an external savior or some kind of magic fix. The real work and the real light that you're looking for is already inside you. It just needs your courage and your effort to be uncovered. So we're left with this final provocative question for ourselves. Instead of just adopting any pre-packaged belief system, this one included, what personal truth will you allow to guide your path? The invitation here is to stay curious, to stay grounded, and above all, to be honest with yourself on your own unique journey.